Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we revisit 6 military artifacts whose origins date prior to July 1914, when World War I broke out in Europe and changed the face of warfare forever. Either through professional curation or personal stewardship, these relics have endured throughout the centuries, and now serve as monuments embedded with the stories of those who lived and served throughout the conflicts of eras long gone by.
My name's Nick Skinner. I brought in today 2 British naval cutlasses, the model P1804s and one 1790s variant reproduction.
Tracing back to the Bronze Age, the sword, in its many forms, has maintained a steady presence throughout history. In 1804, as its coalition forces prepared to face down the French Empire in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain armed its naval services with the first military-issued cutlass, a robust, multi-purpose sabre favoured by seafarers. The P1804 was carried by the Royal Navy in the Battle of Trafalgar, helping to claim its decisive victory over French and Spanish forces. Now an embodiment of early modern warfare, the continued evolution of the cutlass has perpetuated its legacy from a combat essential to ceremonial service piece.
Well, I'd like to welcome Nick Skinner to Militaria today. I was wondering if you could tell us what you've brought in today.
I brought in a collection of swords, a few original pieces, and a couple reproductions I've made that will show us the evolution of the British naval cutlass from around circa 1700 right through to 1804.
These tell a story of edged weapons used by the Royal Navy and by privateers. Show us how the requirement and the need for standardized forms will lead to the P1804 from the time of the mid-18th century when hangers are still being used and called as such.
Early on, they found that they needed a short sword for fighting on shipboard in close quarters. During the whole time frame of the cutlass, you'll find this style of sword referred to as a hanger. Depending on what country you come from as well, these could have various names aboard ship. So you could find a hanger hilted sword like this aboard a ship, let's say in 1690 or 1700, and it would be referred to as a hanger or a cutlass by the British. If you were from France or Spain or one of those places, translation was boarding saber. These were issued on land and called a hanger, and when issued at sea, oftentimes just called a cutlass. By the 1720s, start to see change in this because these were quite expensive to produce, and in the numbers that they required them in, they had to come up with a better method of mass production. By the 1720s, we see a slow evolution over to swords kind of like this one, using tubular iron handles and the figure-8 guard. That style carried on basically unchanged from the 1720s right through to the 1780s. And come the 1790s, they were trying to simplify things even more because they needed more arms. And they start to switch from the tubular iron grips over to these cast iron grips. And from a curved blade to a straight blade, you'll find this style of sword starts to show itself with the iron grip around 1800. By 1804, it had evolved into this sword, and this became the first official British issue cutlass, the P1804.
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming in today, Nick, and sharing your experience and your collection with us. Bladesmith, scholar, Renaissance man, Nick Skinner, right here today. Thanks so much for everything.
It was a pleasure.
My name's Keith Mercer. I work for Parks Canada. I've brought you a snuff box from 1856. A snuff box carries a powdered tobacco, and this particular one is a memento from a famous naval battle from the War of 1812.
Despite its success in the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy was shaken by the upgraded American naval forces in the War of 1812. That changed with an overt challenge issued to the USS Chesapeake by Halifax's HMS Shannon on June 1, 1813. In the Battle of Boston Harbor, British Captain Philip Broke gambled himself, his ship, and his men against those of the USS Chesapeake's Captain James Lawrence. And it paid off. The Royal Navy claimed victory within minutes, and HMS Shannon returned to Halifax, Nova Scotia with the American frigate in tow. Broke recovered from his wounds. His triumphant delivery of the two vessels marked the beginning of a long and decorated career.
Hi Keith, welcome to Militaria. What have you brought us today?
I've brought you a snuff box. Snuff, for people who might not know, is powdered tobacco. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this was the way that people in elite social circles were getting their hit of nicotine, and you literally put it on your finger and you took a big snort and you got your hit that way. Widely circulated and used in homes. Many of them have ended up in museums. The wood is made of fragments from the two warships from the War of 1812. And I'll just read the engravings. And it reads, "Made from a piece of the HMS frigate Shannon in commemoration of the action in Boston Bay in 1813 with the U.S. frigate Chesapeake." This is a pretty special snuff box. It dates from 1856. It was a gift from Admiral Provost Wallis, a British admiral. Admiral Wallis was a hero from the War of 1812, from the famous naval battle between the Shannon and the Chesapeake. By the 1850s, he was an admiral, and a new class of warships, steam, iron-hulled, were commissioned in the 1850s. One of them was the same namesake of his ship, HMS Shannon, and for the launching, he gave this snuff box as a present to the junior officers of the gunroom as a memento from the famous battle of the namesake of the ship from the War of 1812. In June 1813, you had this background of the war going pretty bad for the British. So HMS Shannon had an excellent captain, Captain Philip Broke. He wanted to turn the tide of the war. And that all sets the stage for June 1813. Shannon with a couple more warships were on cruising duty around Boston. The story goes, Captain Brook hovered off Boston in plain sight, so some of the American warships would have been in the port, including USS Chesapeake, and he sent a written challenge to the captain of the Chesapeake, a young officer on the rise named James Lawrence, saying, "Come out and get me." And Lawrence came out and engaged. So the two ships came off Boston Harbor and they engaged. The first broadsides were fired probably within about 100 feet of each other, so pretty darn close. And then they kind of drifted together, and then the British boarded and took the Chesapeake. Man-on-man combat with cutlasses and small swords. It was a quick but brutal, bloody action. And when the dust cleared, the British were victorious, and it became Wallis's duty to take charge of the new prize and then to make the slow journey back to his home port of Halifax. Took 5 long days because the ships were in very poor condition. The two ships arrived on the 6th of June, which just sparked a euphoria into town, and it became one of the most important cultural events in Halifax's early history.
Keith, thank you so much for bringing this beautiful snuff box and the amazing history connected with it.
My pleasure.
Coming up on Militaria, Andrew inspects an Enfield Mark II revolver, the kind issued to the Northwest Mounted Police. Then Jennifer flips through the pages of a dock ledger.
My name is Ken Chislett. I was a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I brought in an Enfield Mark II revolver that was issued to the Northwest Mounted Police. It's a .476 caliber. It was dated 1884.
The Northwest Mounted Police was formed in 1873 to support the Dominion of Canada's desire to expand into its northwestern regions. During this time, Sir John A. Macdonald's government feared American annexation without a swift push of Canadian federal law into frontier territories. Instead, the expansion ignited feelings of resistance and protest among First Nations communities in the regions, leading to the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. In the years following, enforcing public peace between new settlements and Indigenous communities became one of the NWMP's primary responsibilities, along with multiple civic duties, criminal investigations, and regulating the Klondike River during the Gold Rush. In 1920, a post-war merger resulted in its reorganization, and along with its eastern counterpart, the Northwest Mounted Police became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Ken, welcome to Militaria. What can you tell me about this piece of Canadian history that you brought?
This here is a Mark II Enfield revolver. It was one of the guns that was issued to the Northwest Mounted Police in 1884. And they originally came from the British military where they carried them and were surplused over to the Northwest Mounted Police. The serial number of this gun is stamped right here. As you see, fired about a 276 grain bullet with 18 grains of black powder, which gave it about a 720 foot per second muzzle velocity, which is not very much. And it's double action. You can pull the trigger and fire it that way, or you can single action. You can do it both ways. A single action firearm, it requires the hammer to be cocked and then the trigger pulled, the cowboy pistol sort of thing. A double action is where you pull the trigger, the hammer will come back, rotate the cylinder, then fire. The most modern revolvers are all double action. One of the interesting facts of these guns was it fired the first fatal shot in the Northwest Rebellion, the Riel Rebellion in 1885.
The area that we're talking about, which was in the Red River area, what we now call Manitoba, was owned by the HBC company. They decided to sell the land to Canada, but a lot of the people that were living on that land were Métis, who were of Indigenous and French and English ancestry, and they wanted a say in how that land was to be dispersed. In 1870, Louis Riel started the provisional government in order to get rights for the Métis people who inhabited the land at the time. The Canada militia was sent out to try and quell the 1870 Red River Rebellion. Louis Riel took off the United States. He left for many years and performed some legal work within the U.S. In 1884, he was contacted by some Métis people that were living in Saskatchewan so that he could help them in their land rights. And it resulted in a conflict that we now know as the Northwest Rebellion. The Canada militia was sent out along with the Northwest Mounted Police, and it resulted in 3 battles: Duck Lake, Cut Knife, and Batoche. Louis surrendered himself to the Canada militia and eventually was executed by hanging. This revolver could potentially have been used in the Northwest Rebellion. So a very important piece of Canadian history that you have on the table. The artifact that was brought in today is a good example of what early life in Canada was like and the treatment of our Indigenous populations. Louis Riel in Canadian history is infamous or iconic, depending on how you look at it. He was an individual of mixed blood, Indigenous and French. He was educated. He was deeply involved with Métis rights and felt that the Métis people should have a say in the creation of Manitoba. The Indigenous population wanted a say in how the land was going to be divvied up, and they wanted a say in the future of Canada. Louis Riel was fighting for Indigenous rights in the 19th century, which in a way he was ahead of his time. It's a fascinating topic. Yeah, it's a beauty. Thanks for bringing it in.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
My name is Lisa McNiven, and I've brought in an 1802 ledger from Commissioner Inglefield, who is running the dockyard. It's a very special gem of time that's been lost through history.
10 years following the settlement of Halifax in 1749, North America's first naval dockyard was built on the harbour's western shores. Already operating as a seasonal base, the yard's official commission provided Britain's North American station permanent headquarters during the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the War of 1812. As the Royal Navy fortified across decades of conflict, the site quickly expanded to meet its needs. The British left in 1905, and in 1910 the dockyard was transferred to the Canadian government. The site was a major contributor to the Great War's Allied strategic defence until the collision of the SS Mont Blanc and SS Emo devastated the harbour. The Halifax dockyard was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1923.
Hi Lisa, welcome to Militaria. What do you have for us today?
I have a really interesting ledger from 1802 to about 1804, and I think it's a wonderful scope of the early history of Halifax and the Naval Dockyard in Halifax. The requisition orders give an idea of what was a necessity to run a dockyard. They were looking for foodstuffs, they were looking for stationery supplies, they were looking for building supplies. It gives you a real idea of how many people these supplies were serving. It wasn't simply Navy, there was also a large civilian population working at the dockyard at the time. There are so many interesting facts running through this. There's a reference to keeping the King's House at Tufts Cove for requisitions for Napoleonic prisoner of war, requisitions for coal, for blankets, for keeping the prisoners warm. And it's also talking about the growth of Halifax and how the dockyard and the Navy are trying to keep up with this boom.
So as an archivist, this is a very valuable resource for anyone doing Halifax dockyard history and even the history of the Royal Navy being in North America and establishing their naval ports and their operations here. There's always a possibility that there are other copies of the ledgers. I mean, this ledger would have been one of maybe like 100+ ledgers. Can you tell us a little bit about that history in regards to the ledger?
1905, the British Navy leaves. They have a bonfire down at the dockyard, and if it's paper, it's being burnt. So there was a gentleman down at the dockyard. He's seeing this beautiful book in flames. Out of instinct, he kicks it out of the way, tucks it under his arm, and leaves through the gate and goes back into history for at least 100 years, where the book comes back to us through an ancestor of the gentleman that saved this beautiful document.
And what I find absolutely fascinating as well is that if you can see the darkening around the book itself, you can see that it was in the fire and that he actually pulled it from it and that it survived that. And the beautiful binding that exists on it now is not the original cover, but we had a conservator professionally conserve it so that we could keep this piece of history.
It had basically created a vacuum seal. So the fire singed the edges of the book, but it kept the contents pristine. And when you look at the lettering and the wording today, it was like he wrote it yesterday. It's just a perfect time capsule of naval history.
Between 1901 and 1905, the British Navy started to leave Halifax. So anything they didn't want to bring back to England with them, they either sold or disposed of. And so a lot of the ledgers and documents, they already had a copy of it in England. So when this ledger was put into a fire, it wasn't a malicious intent, it was just get everything cleaned up before we go. Lisa, thank you so much for bringing the ledger today. I look forward to diving into the archives with you back at the museum and to explore more of this history.
Absolutely, I look forward to it.
Coming up on Militaria, Kevin uncovers the story behind a pocket watch tied to the Spanish-American War. Then, Jennifer learns the story behind a carved plaque from a naval ship.
My name is Steve Jennings. In my spare time, I am a watch and clock repairer and collector. Today I brought in one of my antique pocket watches. This particular one has a history behind it. You know who the owner was and the fact that he served in the military, and I got his watch going.
During the late 19th century, American nationalism blossomed as the country prepared to participate on the international stage and flex its culture and power. At the same time, Spanish rule to the south was gaining attention for its harsh treatment of the Cuban people, who had long been fighting for independence. In January 1898, the USS Maine departed for Havana Harbor to safeguard American interests. 3 weeks later, it was destroyed and war was declared. 250,000 men and women enlisted, with many initial volunteers hailing from Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, and New York State. The Spanish-American War ended Spain's overseas empire, and the Treaty of Paris made it official on December 10, 1898. The victory helped kick off what is now known as the American Century.
Steve, welcome to Militaria. I was wondering if you could tell us what you've discovered about this.
Well, it's a Waltham pocket watch, a Model 83, which they made a lot of them. It was made in 1900, and the owner's name is faintly printed on the dial in the middle, and this was kind of a popular thing at the time. People would get the dials personalized. So his university fraternity is in the top, and then the Spanish-American War flags are at the bottom because he served in the Spanish-American War.
Now you're saying he served in a National Guard unit. The National Guard is in many ways the backbone of the American Army especially. The motto of the National Guard is "In peace and in war, we are the Guard." So again, as like a young man in New York State at the turn of the 19th century, it would be his sense of duty to be part of the National Guard. And when they go to Cuba, there are upwards of over 2,000 casualties. There's a lot of guerrilla warfare. The Cuban militia especially, and the Spanish troops, they make good use of the jungle and the terrain, and so there's a lot of tension.
I knew he was in the military and that he had served, but I didn't know a whole lot about the conflict. When I saw the painted dial, I thought, I wonder if I could find out who this guy was. Very helpful guy at the Virginia Military Institute who identified the logo as being a university fraternity logo, and then going through lists of folks who served in the Spanish-American War before we finally found him and tied it all together.
Tell us about what his life was like after the war when he came home and he finished his medical degree.
Kind of a sad story. He was a hero. His name was Stacy Williamson, and he was a young guy who joined the New York State National Guard while he was studying at Syracuse University. He was just a young man when he came home, finished his medical degree, opened a family practice in upstate New York, and got married, had a couple of kids. He really didn't get much of a break from all that he saw and experienced during the war. He was made the town health officer and then was put in charge of the Marine Veterans Hospital. So he would have seen the aftermath of the war long after the war was finished.
Certainly, yeah.
He felt suicidal, depressed, and he took his own life in 1908.
At the age of 32, leaving a wife and 2 young children. We know we call this PTSD today. In the time of the American Civil War and the aftermath, I used to call it the soldier's heart. Romans and the Greeks refer to it as melancholia, recorded and noticed for centuries. Well, thanks again, Steve, for bringing this in and sharing the endeavor that you've done in not only restoring the watch and bringing back to life the memory of this healer and soldier.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Tom Pelshaw. Currently, I'm employed as a member of the Corps of Commissionaires in Canada.
The HMS Magpie was a British schooner launched in Jamaica during the summer of 1826. The ship patrolled for pirate and slave ships and protected British interests around the Caribbean. After only 2 months at sea, she capsized off the coast of Cuba. 35 men were on board. Exact details of the event are preserved in written accounts, including an inquiry court-martialed by the British Admiral team. These records tell of harrowing conditions faced by crew members and the heroic actions taken by their young captain, Lieutenant Edward Smith, who perished after desperate, though remarkably composed attempts to save his men. Only 2 survivors emerged from the wreckage. Smith would be recognised posthumously for his bravery by the British Admiralty.
Hi Tom, welcome to Militaria. What have you brought us today?
What I have here is a plaque. The gentleman who owned it was supporting his family during the Great Depression, and unfortunately the fishing industry was down, so to support them he became a rum runner, Caribbean to Lunenburg and back. And of course he'd be bringing in all kinds of interesting alcohol during the Great Depression.
What is unique about the 2 birds here on the front of this carving?
Yes, I looked at it and I thought to myself, they're not hawks, they're not eagles, they're magpies. I thought that was rather unusual. There are certain parts to the plaque that point towards Jamaica. This is a pineapple up here, and these here, you would think on any other British plaque, you might have olive branches. These are actually banana leaves. And then you have a single star under the magpie. A single star signifies the rank of a commander of a ship. And in their talons, each one of them has a talon wrapped around it, what it signifies a cannonade or a cannonball. Hence, again, a warship.
How was this piece found?
A squall, which is like a miniature hurricane, would take the ship and whipped it all over the place. Because it was not heavily weighted, it stayed afloat, but it was partially sinking, and it was pushed ashore. And in that part of the world, with all the ship fare, you would occasionally come across a wreck of a ship. Now, there was a gentleman or a lady walking along the shore one day, and they saw the wreck of the HMS Victory. And the gentleman saw this plaque, and he couldn't just take it, he had to cut it out. So they grabbed an axe, and they literally, you can see the marks here where they had chopped it to remove it from its housing. And that's how it was found.
It's kind of a sad tale with HMS Magpie. She was commissioned in 1826. Do you want to tell us a bit about Lieutenant Edward Smith?
They had the 2 survivors at this board of inquiry, and when they started to give their testimony, they started to cry because they were so taken with the heroism displayed by Lieutenant Smith, in that rather than have his men jump overboard in what was a sea of sharks, he jumped in the water himself and he guided his men. And the most intriguing part, this officer commanded his men and instructed them while he was being eaten by sharks. He never panicked, never raised his voice. And finally, one came by, bit his legs off, and he was dragged slowly to the bottom. He never showed any emotion other than being an officer of the Royal Navy.
Tom, thank you so much for bringing this beautiful artifact from HMS Magpie today.
Thank you kindly for your research.
Oh, you're welcome.
Jennifer, thank you.